Kia ora.
Kia ora, dear. Can I ask you, do you know what chemtrails are?
No, I don't. No, I don't. No idea.
The stuff that's in the atmosphere has changed the weather and yeah.
Have you heard of chemtrails?
Yes, I have.
What's your idea of chemtrails?
I think they're disgusting. They're polluting the world.
Wonderful. Are you familiar with what it's doing to the population?
I've heard various theories, but I've heard that it's all bad. There's various theories about cancer and all sorts of things going around from that.
What else do you know about chemtrails?
I do know that they've started appearing in Northland, and I think it's disgusting. We've got the last really free country in the world, and they're starting to come in here, and I don't want my environment, my beautiful paradise of environment, being polluted by chemtrails.
William Thomas is my guest. I'm George Knapp. This is Coast to Coast AM. He is the author of Chemtrails Confirmed and 4 other books. William, let's go back to this idea of a paper trail. You mentioned at the beginning of the interview that there were papers talking about weather modification, things of that sort, dating back to the 60s. Have you picked it up since then? Is there a piece of paper that says, put this order into effect, we're going to spray this stuff all over the planet? Is it, and if so, were you able to acquire this like through FOIA or something of that sort?
I have 2 things for you, George. The first, I actually has referenced my own book during the break. That memo I earlier referred to President Johnson was a secret 1967 memo, and you were right, military memo from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they were requesting authorization to, quote, implement operational phase of weather modification process, and catch this, previously successfully tested and evaluated in some areas. And this revelation came from a U.S. Senate subcommittee report in July 72. So there you go. That's one major paper trail, if you like. We also have, of course, as I mentioned, the Hughes aircraft patent, and we have lab tests coinciding with that patent. We'll get into those in a second. But of course, it's the Welsbach patent and the U.S. Air Force owning the weather 2025 that are the big smoking guns, if you like, in terms of paper.
All right, Air Force 2025. Tell me about that, because
okay.
I've seen references to it.
Well, that's an Air Force study put out saying that, of course, we're just, this is a blue sky kind of speculation, they said, when in fact it was nothing of the kind. That report talked about weather force specialists flying tanker planes to enable something they called aerial obscuration by spraying out chemicals behind the aircraft to occlude the sky and to change and manipulate weather for military purposes. They actually called it a capability of producing desired weather behavior. Now, remember, this came out in 1995, and we're way down the weather modification road since that was first released.
But, I mean, is that sort of a wishful thinking kind of a thing on the part of the Air Force? Hey, by 2025, we'd like to have this capability. Can you give us the money for it? Or are they just sort of wargaming, speculating about what the future might hold? Or is it something more solid than that?
I think it was more of a trial balloon. The military and other agencies have a habit of leaking a portion of their not only research but actual capabilities ahead of time to acclimate people, if you will, to these new technologies. And while the Air Force claims exactly what you're stating, that this was purely speculative, in fact, the Air Force has been very much involved in weather control since the late 1940s. And we have, of course, Operation Storm Fury during the 60s, which was directed at modifying and changing the tracks of hurricanes. So the Air Force is really heavily invested, in the literal sense of the word, in weather modification. We also have, of course, their Vision 2020, which calls for full spectrum dominance over land, sea, ocean, and undersea all over the earth. And that is a major thrust of the Pentagon, of the U.S. military, and that involves as well weather modification. finally, we know this, and this is a big piece of paper, if you will. H.R. 2977, that's a bill presented, you might recall, by Ohio Representative Dennis Kucinich back in October 2001. And this rocked the chemtrails community as well as Congress, because his Space Preservation Act called for the peaceful uses of space and a ban on exotic weapons. And in Section 7 of his bill, he specifically sought to prohibit chemtrails. He used that word, chemtrails. And in interviews subsequent to that, Kucinich said that as the head of the Armed Services Oversight Committee, he was well acquainted with chemtrail projects. And I was told by people in Santa Cruz, California, that when Kucinich was campaigning for the presidency down there, he was asked about chemtrails at a public meeting, and his reply was, chemtrails are real. So he actually put a bill forward seeking to ban chemtrails.
Before we bring on Cliff, I wanted to ask you about the other kinds of dark motives that have been discussed as possible reasons for spraying stuff in the sky. Diseases, population control, New World Order, that kind of stuff. Do you go that far?
I don't go that far in a sense of deliberate activities to deliberately cull the population. However, I will go further down the road than I used to after talking with my source. I've worked with this gentleman for some 15 years now. We've broken some major stories together. He was even on Coast to Coast under the pseudonym Hank, and he has looked into this and talked to people involved with this program, even from other countries. And he recently told me that, yes, in fact, other programs were being piggybacked on the chemtrails climate modification project. In particular, he said that on some occasions, perhaps 1 in 100 flights, biowarfare simulants were being added and are being added to chemtrails to make people sick enough to report to hospitals and doctors so that military researchers can track the dispersal patterns of these germs. Now, I've written extensively on biowarfare. I wrote a book called Bringing the War Home on the undeclared biowarfare in the Gulf during Desert Storm. I was over there myself and got very sick for my experience with an environmental emergency response team. I learned in my research and said in the book that spreading biowarfare material at high altitudes is counterproductive. These materials are killed off by strong ultraviolet radiation at altitude. They fall to Earth in a very dispersed, diluted pattern and are further degraded by more sunlight and rain. The Iraqi military spread biological chemical agents over American and Allied troops at a place called Al-Jubail, which I visited in Saudi Arabia after the fact, at very low altitudes to keep the concentrations. And, in fact, they made a lot of soldiers, as we later learned, very ill indeed. Well, these new high-altitude chemtrail biowarfare experiments are apparently encapsulating these biowarfare simulants in polymers to protect them from degradation until they can be released automatically at ground level. So I'm very concerned at this because my source said the purpose behind this program is to test the possibility of infecting entire regions, and he said entire nations, with biowarfare materials. And I find this reprehensible and extremely disturbing. Again, this isn't actually being done on a biowarfare level. It is being done on a simulant level. It is making people sick, and the implications are very disturbing.